The town of Dry Creek hadn't seen this much commotion in years. Dust kicked up in lazy spirals as wagons rolled through the main road, decorated in wildflowers and faded bunting. Storefronts wore their best, signs wiped clean, and lanterns hung from window frames. Children ran barefoot, yelling about the bride like she was a fairy tale come alive. But inside the clapboard chapel on the edge of town, the mood was as heavy as summer heat. Clara Hale stood before a cracked mirror in the preacher's quarters, hands folded neatly in front of her white dress. She was just 19, tall and slim, with the kind of beauty that made strangers glance twice but say nothing. Her eyes were dark and distant, like they were fixed on something far beyond the frame of the room. Her lips didn't smile. They hadn't, not once, since the day this wedding was arranged. The lace around her collar scratched at her throat, a reminder that this dress wasn't chosen. It was assigned. The corset squeezed so tight she couldn't breathe right, but no one asked if she could. Behind her, 2 older women fussed with her veil, whispering about how lucky she was to marry Jedediah Knox. Clara said nothing. The truth clung to her ribs like a bruise. This wasn't luck. It was a sentence. Knox was a man of wealth and land, a cattle baron twice her age with 3 fingers missing and a reputation for settling disputes with a boot or a bullet. He'd chosen Clara the way he'd once chosen a horse, quiet, sturdy, compliant. Her father owed Knox more than he could ever repay. Clara had been the answer to that debt. She was the dowry, a daughter traded for the sake of keeping the ranch. Outside the window, guests were beginning to gather. The preacher wiped sweat from his brow and offered her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You ready, miss?" he asked, voice gentle but unsure. Clara nodded slowly, the motion mechanical. She'd rehearsed this: smile, walk, vow, endure. But her thoughts weren't on the altar or the crowd. They were on the barn behind the chapel. More specifically, on the stall where Knox's black stallion, Midnight, was tethered. And even more so, on what was hidden beneath the hay in that stall. A saddlebag she had stuffed 2 nights ago with jerky, a canteen, and a single change of clothes. She blinked, and the mirror gave her a glimpse of a younger self. A girl kneeling in a field of prairie flowers, dirt on her cheeks and wind in her braids. That girl was free. That girl could outrun storms. But she had been gone for years now, buried under manners and obligations and whispered threats. As the women stepped out to fetch the bouquet, Clara moved to the dresser and opened the bottom drawer. There, nestled under a folded handkerchief, was the revolver. It was small, rusted, but it worked. Her uncle had taught her how to shoot when she was 13. She hadn't touched a gun since, not until last week. She picked it up, felt its weight, and slid it into the garter on her thigh beneath the folds of white fabric. Her fingers were steady. Her breath wasn't. The sound of the organ tuning up drifted in from outside. Clara stepped to the window, pushing aside the lace curtain. Across the courtyard, the stable door was cracked open just enough to see Midnight's shadow moving inside. The horse had been restless lately, as if he too knew what was coming. She turned away from the mirror, the veil still untouched on its hook, and walked toward the door. Each footstep was deliberate, not toward the aisle, but toward the edge of something else. Something dangerous, something unknown, but finally hers. Behind her, the church bell began to ring. The wedding was about to begin. And Clara Hale, dressed in white, revolver against her thigh, wasn't planning on attending it. The night air was thick with celebration. Laughter rolled out from the chapel like smoke from a fire, curling into the dark corners of Dry Creek where nobody looked too closely. Inside, glasses clinked and boots stomped against wooden floors as the wedding feast began. The bride and groom, they said, had stepped out for a private moment. Toasts were made. Men grinned into their whiskey. But Clara Hale wasn't blushing behind a barn door. She was slipping through the kitchen's back exit with dirt on her hem and steel in her eyes. She moved like someone who had rehearsed each step in secret, mapping her escape with the precision of a thief. The cool air met her like a slap. Her bare hands clutched the reins she'd hidden beside the trough that morning. And the revolver dug into her thigh as she crossed behind the smokehouse, careful not to make a sound. Her dress snagged on a nail, tearing just above the ankle, but she didn't stop. The chapel lights flickered through the windows like fireflies, and behind their glow, the town slept in its ignorance. Inside the stable, Midnight snorted and stamped his hooves. The big black stallion had always been a creature of rage and muscle, barely tamed, barely willing. Knox kept him more as a symbol than a companion, proof that power could be controlled, broken, and saddled. Clara stepped into the stall without hesitation, her hands firm, her movements smooth as. Midnight tossed his head but didn't rear. He recognized her scent. Maybe he sensed her desperation. She cinched the saddle like she was tying down her own heartbeat. A clatter in the distance, a dropped glass, maybe a guest stumbling outside, made her freeze. She counted 5 seconds, waited, and then pulled herself up. The stallion shifted under her weight, anxious. But Clara whispered into his mane like she used to whisper into her pillow at night. "It's okay. Just run. Please, just run." With a sharp tug of the reins, she kicked once and Midnight exploded into motion. The stable doors burst open with a crack, the sound lost in the fireworks someone had lit near the edge of town. A boy shouted, thinking it was part of the show. But Clara was already halfway down the road, her veil snapping in the wind behind her like a ghost in pursuit. Some women run from a bad marriage. She rode like hell from a death sentence. The stars above blinked coldly as she disappeared into the black stretch of canyon. The town's flickering lights melted behind her, swallowed by rock and night. Her breath came in clouds, sharp and frantic. She didn't look back. Images bloomed in her mind with every hoofbeat. Knox's hand around her wrist, tight enough to leave bruises that never fully faded. The way he smiled in front of others, polished, generous, kind, and then hissed words into her ear in private, the kind of words that twisted your insides. She remembered how he'd come to the ranch the day her father folded, walking through their door like he already owned the place. And in a way, he did. Her father had apologized with his eyes when the papers were signed. Her mother had looked down at the floor and whispered prayers that didn't reach the ceiling. Midnight leapt over a Dry Creek bed, nearly unseating her. But Clara stayed firm. Dust coated her dress. Her hair, once braided neatly for ceremony, was now wild and loose behind her. The veil tore away somewhere along the path and vanished into the wind. She didn't stop to retrieve it. The moon painted the canyon walls in silver. Shadows shifted across stone and brush, turning the desert into a dreamscape of motion and blur. She didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be far. Farther than Knox's reach. Farther than Dry Creek's laws. Farther than the future that had been planned for her since girlhood. Behind her, nothing yet stirred in pursuit. But Clara had lived long enough under Knox's roof to know he'd come for her. Not because he loved her, he was incapable of that, but because she had defied him. She had embarrassed him, and Knox didn't take kindly to that kind of wound. The trail narrowed, forcing Midnight into single stride, his hooves striking sparks off the rocks. The revolver was heavy against her leg, but its weight was a comfort. It meant she had a choice now, even if the road didn't end kindly. As she emerged into a wide clearing dotted with mesquite trees, Clara finally slowed the horse. Midnight huffed and pawed at the earth. She stroked his neck, whispered thanks, and looked up at the stars like they might offer answers. Her chest rose and fell with aching breaths. But she wasn't alone. High on the ridge that crowned the far edge of the canyon, a figure sat on horseback, barely a silhouette against the night sky. They didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. Clara couldn't tell if it was friend or foe. Her hand drifted toward the revolver, not drawing it yet, just remembering where it was. Midnight snorted again, nervous. The figure remained motionless. Then, as if satisfied or curious or both, the rider turned and vanished beyond the ridge. No sound, no light, just gone. Clara stared after them for a long time, unsure what to feel. She wasn't sure if the sight of another rider was a blessing or a curse. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone in the wilderness anymore. And someone had seen her run. By the time Clara reached the watering hole, the sun had burned her skin to raw bronze, and her lips cracked like broken glass. Midnight drank greedily, dipping his muzzle into the still, murky pool, while Clara crouched at the edge and cupped her hands. The water was warm and tasted faintly of dust, but she didn't care. It was the first she'd found in nearly 2 days, and her body was beginning to unravel beneath the desert sun. She stayed in the shade of a low cliff, letting the jagged rocks shield her from the worst of the heat. Her eyes drifted toward the horizon, the way they had dozens of times since she'd fled Dry Creek, always scanning for a shape too steady, too human to be anything but trouble. For a while now, she'd felt something. Not quite fear, but not comfort either. The way coyotes sometimes go silent before they attack, something in the quiet was off. Midnight lifted his head suddenly, ears twitching. Clara's hand instinctively brushed the revolver at her side. She didn't draw it, not yet, but her body stiffened. Across the waterhole, on the far side of the sandy rise, a small dust cloud stirred. No thunder of hooves, no wild charge. Just a whisper of movement, like someone riding soft and slow. She saw him only briefly, a shape on horseback, a man. But he didn't come closer, didn't shout, didn't try to surprise her, just paused, and then vanished back over the ridge. Clara waited for hours after that, letting the sun dip low and the desert chill creep back into the air. She built no fire, left no sign she'd been there. But something had shifted inside her. Someone was behind her. And he was better at this than she was. The following day was quiet. Too quiet. The wind moved the sagebrush, and Clara began to second-guess her instincts. Maybe it was a mirage. Maybe her mind, pushed past its limits, was imagining threats that weren't there. She thought of Knox, thought of the way he used silence like a weapon, how he'd leave her waiting in it for hours just to watch her squirm. But this wasn't his kind of silence. This was different. She could feel it. Somewhere between midday and dusk, she found herself pausing more often, listening, watching. She began to catch glimpses in the distance, brief, cautious moments where the rider made no effort to hide, but didn't approach either. He always rode at a distance, just far enough that she couldn't make out his face, just close enough that she knew it was no coincidence. He was following her, but not like a hunter, more like a shadow. Clara's nerves began to fray. She debated whether to turn around, confront him, or vanish into the brush. But every time she changed direction, he adjusted. Every time she sped up, so did he. And yet, there was no urgency in his movements, no threat. She thought of the stories her grandmother used to whisper, of spirits in the desert that rode the winds, that watched over the brave and the desperate. Maybe he was one of those. Maybe he was a ghost sent to test her. That night, as she sat beneath a crooked juniper, wrapping herself in the frayed edge of her wedding shawl for warmth, she heard the sound she hadn't heard in days. Hoofbeats, soft and deliberate. Her heart began to thrum against her ribs. She stood slowly, hand on the revolver again, eyes fixed to the rise in front of her. The rider crested the hill like he belonged to the night. He was tall in the saddle, back straight, no urgency in his approach. The setting sun cast long shadows behind him, painting the land gold and red. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his brow, and his coat flapped lazily with each step his horse took. Clara stood still, her boots rooted in the dirt. He came close, too close, and then, finally, pulled his horse up beside her. He didn't look at her at first, just took in the horizon. Then, as if greeting an old friend, he said, voice low and measured, "You ain't running fast enough." Clara drew her revolver. Her hand was steady, her eyes locked on his. She aimed right at his heart, but he didn't flinch, didn't raise his hands, didn't even blink. Instead, he turned his head, met her gaze, and tipped his hat slowly, like he'd just said good morning in a quiet town square. His horse shifted beneath him but held its ground. They stood there, still as stones, for several long moments. The kind of moment where everything could shift. Clara's breath was tight in her chest. She tried to read him, his face, his posture, his intent. But he gave away nothing. No smirk, no threat. Just the calm of a man who'd seen storms come and go. Then, without another word, he nudged his horse forward and rode past her. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The sound of hooves faded behind him, swallowed by the desert. Clara lowered her revolver, stunned. Not because she hadn't pulled the trigger, but because, in that strange instant, she hadn't wanted to. Something about the way he looked at her, like he wasn't chasing or cornering her, but maybe just making sure she didn't get lost out here entirely. She turned, watching his silhouette disappear into the horizon. A strange unease settled in her gut, not of danger, but of questions. Who was he? How long had he been trailing her? And why did she feel safer with him ahead of her than behind? Midnight shifted beside her, restless. Clara holstered her weapon and whispered to the horse, "Let's see where he thinks I'm going." Then she mounted up again and followed the man who didn't blink. The high desert turned cold fast once the sun dipped behind the hills, and the land settled into silence, save for the wind that whispered through the sagebrush. Clara found a ridge between two rocks, not far from a dry creek bed, and tethered Midnight in the shadows. The man had stopped only a few hundred feet away, just far enough that neither could pretend the other wasn't there. She could see the flicker of his fire first, Low, small, deliberate. No waste in his movements. He sat with his back to a rock wall, legs outstretched, leaning into the warmth like someone who'd done this more nights than not. He didn't glance her way, didn't call out, didn't offer an invitation, just stoked the flame and went about his business as if he were alone. Clara stayed in the dark. She didn't make a fire, didn't unwrap the food she'd stuffed into her saddlebag days ago. Her stomach had given up growling. Her focus was on the man, this stranger who spoke like the wind and moved like a shadow. Her revolver lay on the ground beside her bedroll, always within reach, always waiting. The man brewed coffee in a small blackened pot that looked older than she was. The scent carried across the space between them, warm and bitter. He hummed an old tune, quiet and mournful, something out of a memory no one had asked him to share. It wasn't a song she recognized, but it made the night feel older, deeper, like they'd slipped back in time. She watched as he poured the coffee into a tin cup and sipped it slow. Still no words, no introductions, no probing questions. Just a man and his fire. Clara stayed where she was, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes sharp. Trust was not something she'd ever had the luxury of giving, not to Knox, not to her family, not to anyone, and certainly not now, not after what she'd done, not after what she was still willing to do if cornered. The man didn't press, didn't pry. He simply leaned back and let the silence wrap around them both. After a while, he cleared his throat, not loudly, just enough to let his voice carry over. "Tracked a herd of wild mustangs once," he said, "out near Red Elk Canyon. 2 weeks I followed 'em. Never got close enough to spook 'em. Just watched, listened, learned." Clara didn't respond. Her fingers curled around the edge of her blanket tighter. "They ran like the wind," he continued, speaking to the fire more than to her. "But they had a rhythm, like the whole bunch moved with one mind. You push too hard, they scatter. You ride patient, sometimes they let you close enough to understand them." He took another sip of coffee. Let the silence stretch again. Clara remained hidden in the dark, the rock at her back cold as bone. She didn't know if the story was meant for her. Didn't know if he was talking about horses or about her. She thought about midnight, how he'd thrown his head and tried to rear when she'd taken him from Knox's stable. How it had taken hours of whispered calm and trembling hands to earn his trust on the trail. He wasn't hers, not really. But he'd let her ride, and that was something. The man's voice broke the quiet again, softer now. "Funny thing, most folks think wild horses are scared of people. But truth is, they're just cautious. Been chased too many times. Makes them suspicious of anyone who gets too close too quick." Another long pause. Then he chuckled once, dry and low. "Hell, maybe they're the smart ones." He didn't say more after that. Didn't ask her name. Didn't ask where she was running to or from. Clara sat in the dark, eyes flicking between the flame and the silhouette beside it. She wanted to hate him, wanted to fear him, wanted to put him in the same box as every other man who ever tried to own her. But he hadn't tried anything. He just sat. That was more unsettling than any chase would have been. Her muscles ached with tension. Sleep teased her but never arrived. She shifted now and then, tried to find a comfortable position on the hard-packed ground, but her mind kept spinning. Who was this man? Why wasn't he pressing her for answers? And why, for the first time in days, Did her breath feel like it was no longer caught in her throat? She remembered Knox's voice. Cold, sharp, certain. No man respects a quiet woman unless she learns to bite. He'd said it with a laugh, the kind that never reached his eyes. Clara had been quiet her whole life. Until the night she wasn't. Now, sitting in the dark with a man who didn't demand a single word from her, Clara felt something strange. Not comfort, not safety, but possibility. He moved just once more before sleep came, tossed a handful of sand on the fire, dimming the glow to embers. Then he pulled his coat tighter and leaned his head back against the stone. A shadow against shadows. Clara turned her gaze to the revolver lying near her bedroll. She stared at it for a long time. Remembered how heavy it had felt the night she tucked it beneath her wedding dress. How light it had felt when she pointed it at her new husband's head and chose freedom. Her fingers didn't reach for it this time. She let the silence settle. Not because she trusted him, but because, for one night, she didn't feel hunted. Just watched, and oddly understood. The night settled warmer than the last, though the wind carried a warning. A dry, pulsing rhythm against the sagebrush and gravel, hinting that the land was restless. Clara stayed on the ridge again, but this time, when the man lit his fire, she walked down to sit closer. Not too close, just on the other side of the flame. Between them, the fire cracked and spit like a live thing trying to speak. She didn't say anything for a long time, neither did he. He poured coffee again. Same battered tin cup, same old rhythm. The night hummed with insect wings and shifting sand. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried out, a sharp echo that faded into the emptiness. Clara stared into the flames, hands wrapped tight around her knees. The firelight painted shadows under her eyes, across her cheekbones. Her dress, once white, was now a map of dirt and desert stains. Her hair hung loose, wild, a different kind of veil now. Then she finally spoke. "What's your name?" He looked at her for the first time that night. "Wade," he said simply. She nodded. "Clara." "I know." She didn't flinch, but her body stiffened ever so slightly, like a wire pulled taut. "You been following me?" she asked, voice quiet but steady. Wade shrugged a shoulder. "Not at first." The fire popped. Embers floated upward like red stars that forgot which way heaven was. She eyed him carefully. "You knew my name. You knew where I was coming from." "I knew Jedediah Knox." The name hit the air like a blade thrown hard and fast. Clara's gaze narrowed. "Are you a lawman?" Wade took a long sip of coffee. His expression didn't change. "Not anymore." Silence again, but different this time. Not the silence of strangers. More like two people standing on either side of a canyon, tossing pebbles to see if they'd reach. She finally asked, "So what are you then?" He poked at the fire with a stick. "Wrong man in the wrong life for a long time. Thought I was doing right once. Turns out I was just holding the leash for people like Knox." Clara's jaw clenched. Her fingers gripped the fabric of her skirt. "You worked for him." "Worked near him. Long enough to see the kind of man he was." He looked at her, and his voice softened. "Long enough to understand why you ran." She said nothing, just looked down, watching the firelight ripple across the dust between them. "You didn't steal freedom that night," Wade said quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, sharp and wounded. No, no, he replied. You just borrowed time. The words hung in the smoke. Clara felt them crawl across her skin. She didn't know if it was a warning or a kindness, maybe both. She shifted closer to the fire without realizing it. The warmth had become a strange comfort, like a body remembering softness after too many nights of cold stone and colder silence. I thought he'd kill me, she said finally, on our wedding night. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean, I saw it in his eyes, like I was something to break, to cage. Wade nodded once, slow. That man didn't love anything he couldn't control. Her voice faltered, but she pushed forward. He used to bring his revolver to the dinner table. Just sat it there beside his glass, like it belonged next to the salt shaker. Wade didn't interrupt. He had rules, she continued. How I sat, how I chewed, how I looked at him. He said a good wife didn't raise her voice. So I stopped talking. Thought maybe silence would protect me. She looked back at the flames. But even silence has a weight. It starts to press down until you can't breathe. The fire crackled and hissed, a low, knowing sound. Wade leaned forward slightly, placing the empty tin cup on a flat rock. How'd you get the revolver past him? Clara allowed a flicker of pride to show in her voice. He wanted me to wear stockings. I hated them. But that night, I wore them for the first time. She glanced up, meeting Wade's eyes. Because I'd already planned where I'd hide the gun. He gave a small smile. Clever. She returned it, just barely. They sat for a long time, neither speaking, just letting the flames tell the rest. The wind picked up, stirring the loose grit on the ground. The air changed, sharper, faster. Wade looked up toward the north horizon. You smell that? He asked. Clara sniffed once and caught it. Dust and heat and something heavy approaching. Sandstorm? She asked. He nodded. Coming fast. She turned her head and saw it. A faint wall in the distance, rising like a ghost from the desert floor. It rolled across the plain like a moving bruise, blotting out stars as it came. How bad? She asked. Bad enough, Wade said. We'll need to hunker down. He stood and began gathering supplies, moving efficiently. Clara stayed seated, eyes fixed on the approaching cloud. Her fingers curled around the revolver at her side, not out of fear, but instinct. Wade stopped for a moment, looked at her. I ain't here to take you back, he said. I don't got a badge, and I sure as hell don't work for Jed Knox. Clara didn't answer right away, just studied him in the rising wind. Then why are you here? He hesitated. For once, he didn't seem to have a ready answer. Maybe I'm just tired of letting men like him write the endings. The sandstorm roared louder now, the first grains beginning to bite at their faces. Clara stood and moved beside him, close enough to smell the dust and coffee on his coat. Then I guess we write our own. And with that, the wind swallowed their words, and the storm came down hard. The wind came like a living wall, screaming, clawing, relentless. Dust filled the air until it wasn't air anymore, but a dry sea of sand and static. Wade led the way, eyes squinted under the brim of his hat, guiding Clara through the chaos like he'd done this before. She followed close, her hand gripping the back of his coat, each step a struggle against the rising storm. There was no horizon now, no sky, just a suffocating swirl of grit and ghost-colored wind. They stumbled across the entrance to a shallow cave cut into the base of a cliff. Wade ducked inside first, then turned to pull her in after him. Once they were in the dark, the silence was almost deafening after the storm's roar. Only the moan of the wind at the cave mouth remained, distant and aching. Wade dropped his gear and shook the dust from his shoulders. Clara collapsed onto a flat stone shelf, coughing hard, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. Her face, streaked with dust and sweat, looked older than it had 2 nights ago. Her wedding veil was long gone, and the girl who had ridden off on a stolen stallion was now a woman with steel in her bones, and something else beginning to bloom beneath. Wade lit a small lantern, its glow barely touching the cave walls. "We'll stay here until it passes," he said, voice low, calm. "Storm like that can strip the hide off a horse." She nodded, still catching her breath. "You always this prepared?" He gave a half smile. "You don't ride long in this land without finding yourself in the teeth of something wild." They shared a quiet moment, both listening to the wind's howl outside, both understanding it wasn't just the desert storm they were sheltering from. It was everything. Everything that chased them. Everything they hadn't said. The cave was small, but wide enough for space between them. Even so, something in the air had shifted. Maybe it was the storm, stripping away layers of resistance. Maybe it was time. Or maybe it was the silence that no longer felt dangerous. Wade leaned back against the rock and watched her. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. Clara stared at the lantern flame, the flicker catching in her tired eyes. "All I've done is think about the next move, the next hour. I haven't thought past that in a long time." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "You could keep running? The desert's got plenty of corners to vanish into." She looked up at him. "And if I don't?" He studied her, serious now. "Then ride with me. I know a place in New Mexico, quiet, high upland. River runs through it. No one would find us there unless we let him." "You don't even know me," she said softly. "I know enough." She smiled, but it wasn't joy. It was exhaustion. "You sure I wouldn't just poison your life with mine?" Wade shook his head slowly. "I ain't looking for perfect. I'm looking for honest. You've got pain in you, Clara. So do I. But sometimes 2 busted things can hold each other up better than one standing alone." She didn't respond, just looked at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Outside, the wind began to slow. The worst had passed, leaving only a restless whimper in its place. But inside the cave, something else was building. Something less wild, more human. Clara's eyes welled suddenly, the tears silent and unexpected. She pressed the heel of her hand to her face, trying to hold them back. But they came anyway. Slow, steady, honest. "I haven't cried since the day he put that ring on my finger," she whispered. "Not even when I ran." Wade didn't move toward her. He didn't offer a comforting hand or a quiet hush. He just stayed where he was, letting her have it, letting her break. And in that stillness, she found something close to safety. "I am so tired of being afraid," she said. Wade nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's stop running. Together." The lantern flickered, casting long shadows along the cave's walls. Clara wiped her face with her sleeve, breathed in deep. She looked at him for a long time, then turned her gaze to the mouth of the cave, where the sky had begun to show again. a pale gold hue fighting through the dust. They slept in shifts, each half trusting the other not to disappear. When the first light of dawn crept into the cave, it was Clara who woke first. She watched Wade sleeping on his side, hat tilted over his face, the slow rhythm of his breath steady like a promise. She sat for a long moment, listening to it. Then she stood. She packed her things quietly, folded a piece of cloth into a note, and left it atop his saddlebag, where she knew he'd see it first. Her boots echoed softly against the rock as she stepped out into the clearing morning. The desert greeted her like an old adversary, silent, wide, and uncertain. She mounted Midnight and didn't look back until the cave was a speck behind her. The sun rose slowly over the hills, and her figure moved like a whisper across the waking land. When Wade finally stirred, he reached for the saddlebag and found the note before anything else. Her handwriting was sharp but careful. The message was short. "Meet me at Bitter Rock, sundown." He read it twice, then folded it neatly, tucking it into his coat. And for the first time in a long while, he smiled. The ride to Bitter Rock was quiet, but not in the way silence used to feel. No longer sharp, no longer waiting to be broken. It was a quiet that settled into Wade's bones, heavy but calm. The desert rolled past in waves of rust and gold, the wind carrying whispers from long-dead rivers and buried footprints. He knew the way by memory, not from maps, but from instinct. The kind that came from a man who'd spent more time with land than people. Bitter Rock rose like a crooked tooth out of the canyon floor, jagged and sharp, marked by time and weather. It was a place of endings for some, beginnings for others. Legend said outlaws buried their regrets at its base, and lovers carved their names into its spine before vanishing into history. Wade didn't care much for stories, but as he approached the ridge, saddle creaking beneath him, something about the shape of her standing there made him believe this place still held power. Clara stood near the edge of the cliff. No horse beside her, no gun in her hand. Just her, wind-kissed, hair untamed, dress dusty from the trail. Her arms were crossed, not out of defiance, but as if trying to hold herself together in one piece. Her eyes weren't on him. They were on the canyon, stretching wide beneath her, where shadows shifted and danced across broken stone. Wade dismounted slowly. Midnight huffed behind him, but he didn't tie the reins. He didn't need to. His eyes never left her. "You came," she said without turning. "You asked." He took a few steps closer. She didn't move away. "I left the horse at the base," she added. "Didn't want it too close to the edge." Wade nodded but said nothing. The wind tugged at their clothes like a restless spirit. Clara took a slow breath, then turned to face him fully. Her eyes were clearer than he remembered. Less fear, more resolve. But the weight of something long carried still sat behind them. "I lied to you," she said. "Not about running or Knox. That part was true. But there's more." He waited. "I didn't just run because he was cruel. I ran because I thought I'd kill him if I stayed." Wade blinked once. No surprise, no judgment, just stillness. She continued. "He didn't just hurt me. He hurt my sister too. She came to live with us after Mama passed. She was 17. Her voice cracked, but she caught it, swallowed hard. "He said it was her fault. Said I was lucky to be married to a man who could provide. Said I owed him silence." The wind caught the words as soon as they left her mouth, scattering them into the canyon below. "I tried to leave once before," she went on. He dragged me back, had the sheriff on his side, had everyone. So I stayed. Until the wedding night. Until I realized the only way to keep my soul was to steal it back. Wade stepped closer, but not too close. Just enough. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. But I needed someone to know. Just one person. He met her eyes then. You don't need forgiveness for surviving. The words landed gently. No weight, no pressure, just truth. And for Clara, truth was a rare kind of kindness. They stood there, two figures shaped by dust and fire, watching the horizon glow under the low sun. The canyon before them stretched wide and deep, cut by centuries of water and time, just like them. Clara sat down on a flat rock, pulling her knees close. Wade joined her, both of them watching without speaking. Sometimes the best things didn't need sound. Sometimes silence said what mouths couldn't. The air grew cooler as the sun slid behind the distant cliffs, their shadows growing longer with each minute. The hush between them deepened, not heavy, but full, like the pause before a new chapter. Wade finally broke it with a simple question. What now? She looked at him, and her lips curled into something close to a smile. I don't want to run. He nodded. She added quieter this time. Not alone. He didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle, a piece of cloth wrapped in twine. He set it between them. What's that? She asked. A map, he said. Not to anywhere marked, but to where we might belong. She untied the twine and unfolded the cloth. It wasn't a map in the usual sense. No towns, no roads. Just marks, stars, rivers, notes scribbled in a careful hand. Places he'd seen, places he thought about going. And one circle, far in the corner, drawn with firmer lines than the rest. What's here? Hope, he said, and meant it. Clara looked out over the canyon one last time, then back to the map. She traced the circle with her fingertip. I think I'd like to see it. Wade stood and offered his hand. Then let's go before the night gets ideas. She took his hand, not like someone being pulled, but like someone choosing to rise. As they walked away from the cliff's edge, their shadows stretched behind them, long and tangled, touching the earth like old stories ready to be rewritten. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. And in the hush between heartbeats and hoofbeats, something unspoken settled between them. Like dust finding peace after the storm. The sun broke over the horizon in slow, honey-colored layers, peeling back the night like an old bandage. Light spilled across the open plains, touching every rock and thorn bush with a glow that felt borrowed. Like morning wasn't a promise, but a second chance. Clara stirred in the saddle, the rhythm of the horse already stitched into her bones. Wade rode beside her, slightly ahead, the brim of his hat shadowing eyes that hadn't truly rested in years. They hadn't spoken much since Bitter Rock. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths didn't need repeating. A shared fire, a held gaze, the map folded between them in her saddlebag. It was enough. Silence had become a language of its own, one they both spoke fluently. The world around them was wide and hushed, like it was holding its breath. No birds yet, no signs of pursuit. But Clara still glanced back every so often, not out of fear, but habit. She wasn't sure if they were running from something anymore, or riding toward it. Maybe both. Their shadows stretched long on the earth behind them, side by side, reaching like fingers towards something they couldn't name. Dust curled up from their horses' hooves, caught in the light, turning every step into a small act of vanishing. The trail ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, that didn't feel like danger. It felt like freedom. Clara adjusted the scarf around her neck, more out of ritual than need. "You think they'll come after me?" she asked without looking over. Wade didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the land rose in slow, golden waves. "Maybe," he finally said. "But the West's a big place, and they'd have to outride ghosts first." She gave a soft, dry laugh. "Then we might be safe." The horses moved as one, in no rush, yet with purpose. It wasn't an escape anymore. It was a direction, a choice made at dawn and renewed with every hoofbeat. As the sun climbed higher, the desert came to life around them. Cactus arms reaching skyward, jackrabbits darting between brush, vultures circling high above as if waiting for someone to give up. But neither of them had any plans to. A breeze swept across the plain, warm and dry, carrying the scent of mesquite and something faintly metallic, like old blood buried deep in the dirt. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind pass through her like water over stone. She opened them again and looked at Wade. "You always ride alone before this?" she asked. He nodded. Easier that way. No one to lose. No one to watch you lose yourself. "And now?" He didn't answer, but the way he glanced sideways at her said enough. They rode on through the morning, crossing shallow creeks and sun-bleached ridges, saying little but sharing everything. Once she reached for her canteen and found his hand already offering it. Later, he slowed his pace to match hers, even when his horse clearly had more speed left in it. Small gestures, big meanings. Clara thought of all the stories she'd heard growing up, about gunslingers and gold, about women who rode like devils and men who chased justice until it broke them. She never imagined she'd be one of those stories, and certainly never imagined someone would ride beside her without needing to be her hero. The past still rode with them. That much hadn't changed. It clung to the saddle like dried blood, showed itself in quiet moments, in distant stares, in scars they didn't always talk about. But it wasn't riding them anymore. It was just part of the trail. At one point, they crested a high bluff, the view stretching out before them like the end of the world. Far below, a river cut through the land like a ribbon of silver, winding around boulders and patches of green. It looked untouched, untamed. Clara reined in her horse and stared down at it. "That's beautiful," she whispered. Wade pulled up beside her. "Ain't many things left that still are." They sat there for a long moment, side by side, soaking in the quiet. The wind was stronger up high, carrying the distant sound of something that might have been a wolf, or just the wind itself howling through a rock. She looked over. "If we ride far enough, think we'll find peace?" He tilted his head, thoughtful. "The West don't give you peace," he said. "But sometimes it gives you someone to ride beside." His words hung in the air like the last note of a song neither of them wanted to end. Eventually, they moved on. The camera, if there'd been one, would have pulled back slowly now, climbing higher, watching the two riders grow smaller against the endless canvas of sand and sky. No music played, just the sound of hoofbeats fading into distance, into memory. two silhouettes disappearing into golden dust, their shadows swallowed by the morning light. And then, slowly, everything faded. Not to black, but to the warm color of hope.